They told us Ham was cursed. But what if I told you that was never true? You've heard of Cush, father of Ethiopia. You've studied Misraim, the seed of Egypt. You've feared the name Canaan, forever linked to a curse. But there was a fourth son, Phut. He appears once, then disappears into silence. No great sin, no condemnation, no legacy, or so it seems. Why? Because in Scripture names are never accidents. Lineages are not filler. So why in the most sacred genealogy of mankind would one name rise only to be buried by time? What if Phut wasn't forgotten, but hidden? And what if by following his trail we discover that sometimes the ones who are silent are the ones God is protecting? Phut didn't build Babel, he didn't rebel, he wasn't cursed, and yet the world erased him. So who was Phut? A forgotten name, or a forgotten warning, or maybe a forgotten witness? This is not just a question of history, it's a question of justice, of theology, of how far humanity will go to twist a narrative even if it means silencing an entire people. But today we follow the silence, we trace the shadow, because where the Bible is silent, God may still be speaking. So come with me, back to Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, because hidden within that ancient list is a mystery that could rewrite everything you thought you knew about race justice and divine purpose. And the name is Phut, Fan 1, the sons of Ham, and the silence around Phut. After the flood, a new humanity begins. Noah steps out of the ark with his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From them, the entire world would be repopulated. But Ham's line is complicated. The Bible names 4 sons of Ham, Cush, Misraim, Canaan, and Phut. Each of them would leave behind a legacy that echoes through history. Cush, father of Ethiopia, of Nimrod, of rebellion and empire. His name is often tied to strength, to kingdoms forged in the blazing heat of Africa. Misraim, the root of Egypt. The towering pyramids, the Nile gods, pharaohs who enslaved Israel and defied the living God. A civilization that danced with divine judgment. Canaan, the most infamous. Cursed by Noah for reasons that still provoke debate. His descendants would become the very nations that Israel would be commanded to drive out. Idolatry, child sacrifice, open rebellion. These 3 names ring with history, conflict, consequence. But then there is Phut. He appears in the same sentence, but with no story, no empire, no judgment, no praise, nothing but his name. And that's the rupture in the pattern. You see, each son of Ham became a symbol. Cush of ambition, Misraim of domination, Canaan of corruption. But Phut, he carries no weight of narrative, no theological burden, no scandal or downfall to warn about. Instead, he is neutral. In the great drama of early biblical history, where names become nations and bloodlines become battlegrounds, Phut is the only one whose path is quiet. And that makes him more than a footnote, because the silence around Phut isn't just literary, it's theological. He doesn't represent rebellion like Canaan. He doesn't represent idolatrous civilization like Misraim. He doesn't even represent the ambition of empire like Cush. He represents what isn't said, the unexplored, the unjudged, the unburdened. And maybe that's exactly why so many commentators and traditions simply skipped over him, because he didn't fit the story they were telling. But the Bible still names him. And in Scripture, that alone carries weight. Why would the holy text include a man with no recorded history unless his absence meant something? Perhaps Phut's legacy is not in what he built, but in what he never became. And that opens a new kind of question. What does it mean to be named, but not defined? What if Phut stands as a mirror for those who were born into legacy, but not born into sin? And as we move deeper, we'll begin to see how his silence becomes a signal, a warning, and a revelation. But before we can understand that mystery, we need to clear away one of history's most dangerous lies, the so-called curse of Ham, because Phut was never cursed, but the world has treated him like he was. Let's fix that next. Part 2. The curse that was never his. Let's go back to the moment that has haunted generations. Genesis 9:25. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. It's one of the most controversial verses in all of Scripture. And yet it's also one of the most misquoted, because Noah doesn't say cursed be Ham. He doesn't say cursed be all of Ham's descendants. He says clearly and precisely cursed be Canaan, only Canaan. But that hasn't stopped centuries of distortion. For over 1,000 years, theologians, rulers, and empires have twisted this verse into a blanket curse, stretching it across all of Ham's children from Cush to Misraim to Phut. And worse, many used it to justify slavery, racism, and the subjugation of entire peoples, especially in Africa. They called it the curse of Ham. But it was never Ham who was cursed. This was not a universal condemnation of a bloodline. It was a specific judgment on a specific descendant, Canaan, whose future actions would defy God, embrace depravity, and war against the chosen people. And yet, Phut got caught in the crossfire, not by God, not by the Bible, but by the hands of men who reshaped Scripture to fit their systems of power. That's not theology. That's manipulation. And here's the deeper truth: God never curses people based solely on lineage. He judges by character, by choice, by covenant, or the rejection of it. The idea that God would punish an entire race because of one man's sin, that's not biblical. That's imperial theology, colonial theology, the kind used to control, not to reveal. Let's go back again, this time with clean eyes. Genesis 9 tells us that Ham saw his father Noah naked, a moment of dishonor. But when Noah wakes, he doesn't curse Ham, he curses Canaan. Why? That's a mystery still debated. Some scholars believe it was prophetic, pointing toward Canaan's future wickedness. Others suggest it was because of some deeper family dynamic now lost to time. But one thing is certain: Phut had nothing to do with it. He wasn't there, he wasn't involved, he wasn't even born when it happened. So why has the name of Phut alongside Cush and Misraim been dragged through the mud of history? Why was he labeled guilty by association? Because people prefer broad strokes. They like simple categories: cursed and blessed, black and white, saved and damned. But the Bible doesn't work that way, and neither does God. Scripture is more precise than we give it credit for. And when we ignore that precision, we don't just misread the text, we misrepresent the heart of God. So let's be clear: Phut was not cursed. He was not judged. He was not condemned. He was named. And in that name lies dignity, identity, a place in the divine record. His silence is not shame. It's space waiting to be reclaimed. But now that we've cleared away the false curse, a more difficult question emerges. If Phut wasn't cursed, then who was he, what became of his descendants, and why does he reappear centuries later, fully armored, standing beside Egypt in the fires of war? What was he guarding? We're about to find out, because the next time Scripture mentions Phut, it's on the battlefield. Part 3. Phut on the map. A forgotten warrior lineage. Phut may be silent in Genesis, but silence does not mean disappearance. Centuries later, long after Noah's sons had become nations and empires, the name of Phut resurfaces, but not in a genealogy. This time he stands in armor. We find him in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 46. Egypt is under threat, its armies trembling. God declares judgment on Pharaoh Necho and the proud forces of the Nile. And in the list of Egypt's military allies, Phut appears. Come up, O horses, and rage, O chariots. Let the mighty men come forth. Cush and Phut that handle the shield. Jeremiah 46:9. Did you catch that Phut is listed as a warrior, a shield bearer, not a king, not a priest, not a prophet, a soldier on the front lines? And this is not an isolated mention. In Ezekiel 35, as the prophet speaks doom over Egypt and its allies, he writes Ethiopia and Libya, Phut and Lydia, and all the mingled people, and Chub, and the men of the land that is in league shall fall with them by the sword. Once again, Phut is named alongside Cush. Once again, he is part of a military alliance. Once again, he is at the heart of empire conflict. But here's what's strange, he's never the aggressor. Phut always shows up as a defender, a shield bearer. In ancient Near Eastern warfare, the shield bearer wasn't just a background soldier. He was the one who stood in front of the archer, the one who blocked the spear meant for someone else, the one who took the blow to protect a greater force. It's a symbolic role, a role of loyalty, strength, and sacrifice. So now we begin to see the silhouette of Phut's legacy, not cursed, not erased, but forged into a warrior nation, quiet, strong, and ready when called. Historians and scholars widely associate Phut with the peoples of ancient Libya, a vast and diverse region west of Egypt, bordering the Mediterranean and stretching into the desert. From there emerged tribes that would fight alongside Egypt in numerous conflicts, not as vassals but as respected allies. They were desert-trained, fierce, mobile, not builders of temples but defenders of kingdoms. And that matters, because in a world where most biblical nations are defined by their sins, their idolatry, their violence, their pride, Phut stands apart. He does not provoke war, he does not blaspheme. He stands at the gate, shield in hand. The Bible doesn't give him a speech, it gives him a stance. And that's a powerful thing, because sometimes God doesn't need you to preach, he just needs you to hold the line. But the question is, who was Phut protecting, and why does the Bible record his loyalty only to let him vanish again? Was his silence once again a shield, or was something far older being hidden in plain sight? To answer that, we must look beyond maps and battles and into the sacred geography of Africa itself. Because where Phut stood reveals more than we think. Part 4. Africa wasn't cursed, the legacy of Libya. Let's redraw the map. Not the one made by colonizers, but the one revealed in Scripture. Between the towering legacy of Egypt and the mysterious mountains of Maghreb lies a forgotten stretch of desert ancient Libya. And according to biblical tradition and ancient historians alike, Phut was the father of this land. Yes, Phut, the quiet son of Ham, became the patriarch of a people spread across the northwestern curve of Africa. Not just a tribe, but a legacy. But here's the twist. While other nations in Scripture are judged, destroyed, or shamed, Libya is not. Phut's descendants didn't build the Tower of Babel. They didn't war against Israel. They didn't set themselves up as false gods. And they weren't struck down by divine fire or swallowed by the earth. Instead, they remained present, part of the narrative, named but not condemned, visible but not villainous. This matters because for far too long, Africa has been portrayed as the outsider in the biblical story, as if the land of black skin and sun-scorched soil was somehow cursed, unchosen, or irrelevant. But nothing could be further from the truth. Africa was there before Babylon, before Rome, when Moses walked out of Egypt, when Jesus fled as a child, and Phut's legacy stands as a witness to that presence. The Bible doesn't erase Africa, it names it. It names Cush, Sheba, Egypt, and yes, it names Phut, the ancestor of Libya. But history books written under empires, Roman, European, colonial, chose to minimize that presence, because a strong Africa didn't fit their theology. An African lineage without a curse that disrupted the narrative they needed to justify chains. Africa wasn't cursed, the Scripture whispers, it was called. And Phut, standing silently in Genesis then as a warrior beside Egypt, is proof. He represents a people who were never judged, never erased, just ignored by the historians of power. And that silence, it was not divine, it was political. Because you can't tell a story of world domination if the continent you seek to conquer is already written into the divine plan. And here's the wave that crashes through all of this. Africa is not a footnote in redemption history. It is part of the spine. Phut didn't need to build temples. He didn't need to defy God to get noticed. He didn't need to fall to become important. His role was quieter, but no less sacred. And his descendants carried that same dignity. From the Berber tribes to the Tuareg, from the Saharan caravans to the Libyan coasts, Phut's legacy spread in silence, not sin. And now that silence is being broken. Because the story of Africa in the Bible is not just one of geography, it is one of inheritance. But what exactly was Phut's inheritance, and why might his very invisibility be the key to a divine mystery we've overlooked? To answer that, we must explore the theology of silence itself. What does it mean when God chooses not to say more? Let's step into that mystery next. Part 5. When God hides a name. Theology of silence. What if I told you that in the Bible, silence isn't always neglect? Sometimes silence is sacred. We've been taught to measure importance by noise, by how loud someone speaks, how often they're mentioned, how central they are to the plot. But Scripture doesn't work that way. In fact, some of the Bible's most powerful figures were hidden before they were revealed. Joseph betrayed, sold, and imprisoned, forgotten in Pharaoh's dungeon for years before rising to power in a single day. Moses exiled to the wilderness for 4 decades, tending sheep in silence before being called through a burning bush. Esther, an orphaned girl tucked inside a pagan palace, unknown and unseen, until the moment she was needed to save a nation. God's pattern is clear. He hides what he intends to preserve. And maybe Phut was hidden for that same reason. He wasn't tangled in rebellion like Canaan. He wasn't entangled in Egypt's idolatry like Misraim. He wasn't chasing empires like Cush. He was simply unrecorded. But unrecorded doesn't mean unused. Unseen doesn't mean unworthy. Unnamed in the plot doesn't mean unchosen in the plan. There's a deep and often uncomfortable theological truth here. Sometimes God anoints a person not to speak, but to be silent. Not to lead from the stage, but to hold the wall. Not to build a kingdom, but to protect one that's coming. It's what I call anointed absence. And in the case of Phut, that absence speaks volumes. Because when everyone else's descendants were building towers, forging idols, and declaring war, Phut's name remained still. He wasn't part of the chaos. He wasn't part of the corruption. And in a world falling apart, sometimes the holiest thing you can do is stay out of it. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. Scripture tells us that God will one day judge every word spoken and every motive hidden. But what about those who were faithful in silence? What about the shield bearers, the desert watchers, the unnamed guardians? Phut belongs to that sacred category. It's no accident his story fades behind the curtain. It's design. Because when God hides a name, he doesn't erase it. He sanctifies it. He reserves it for a time when silence is more powerful than speech. And here's the paradox. The less we hear about Phut, the more we're invited to wonder about him, to imagine, to trace, to ask, why did God protect this name from scandal, from spectacle? And in doing so, he challenges our obsession with visibility. You don't have to be on the mountain to be holy. You don't have to be quoted to be chosen. You don't have to be recorded to be remembered in heaven. Sometimes being left out of history is God's way of writing you into eternity, and that's the power of Phut. But this mystery doesn't end in theology. Because while Phut's biblical silence is sacred, ancient historians outside the Bible didn't ignore him. They remembered, and what they recorded might just change everything we thought we knew. Let's follow that trail next. Part 6, Outside the Bible. Josephus and the Desert Warriors. The Bible may go silent on Phut's story, but history does not. If we step beyond the sacred text into the dusty scrolls of ancient historians, we begin to see a figure emerge. A legacy not lost, but scattered across time. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century, gives us a crucial clue. In his work, Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes, Phut was the founder of Libya and called the inhabitants Phutites from himself. This single sentence opens a doorway. Phut, according to Jewish historical memory, was the father of the ancient Libyans, a people of vast deserts, nomadic warriors, and coastal traders. Not Egyptians, not Canaanites, not Babylonians, but their own people with their own story, and that story traces across the sands of North Africa. Many scholars now believe the descendants of Phut may have included groups like the Berbers, an indigenous people of North Africa who predate Arab conquests and Roman colonization. Others link them to the Nubians, known for their kingdom south of Egypt and their long resistance against imperial domination. But what all these peoples share is this: they lived on the borderlands between empires, between cultures, between gods. And in many Jewish traditions, those who lived far from the centers of idolatry were seen not as ignorant, but as preserved. The rabbis spoke of desert peoples isolated, hardened by climate, untouched by the seductive pull of idol worship. They lived close to the earth and closer to the raw forces of nature. Not every desert was a curse. Some deserts were sanctuaries. And perhaps that's what Phut's people became, a buffer between the chaos of empire and the quiet of obedience. They weren't tied to Babylon. They weren't chained to Assyria. They weren't swallowed by Egypt's pantheon. They remained in between. In fact, some ancient records suggest that Phut's descendants served as border guard scouts and mercenaries, not because they were weak, but because they were trusted. You don't place unreliable men on the edge of your kingdom. You place the loyal ones, the fierce ones, the ones who know how to move silently through sand and stone. These desert warriors weren't builders of monuments, but they were builders of protection. And that matters. Because in a world obsessed with power, sometimes the strongest role is not to conquer, but to contain. Phut's people may not have carved their names into stone, but they carved a space between nations, between chaos and order, between forgotten and favored. And that's where their brilliance lies. What if God chose Phut to occupy the space no one else could, not the throne, not the temple, but the threshold, the place where empires ended and exile began? The more we dig, the more we realize Phut's descendants weren't erased. They were simply placed where no one thought to look. But now looking back, we see them on the edges of civilization holding their ground. And soon, their silence would be weaponized. Because when scripture gets misused to justify evil, Phut's name would once again be pulled into a battle he never started. The next part of our story: how this forgotten name became entangled in one of the darkest lies in history. Part 7: Twisted Scriptures and Racial Lies. Let's talk about one of the darkest manipulations in biblical history. For centuries, a single idea was preached from pulpits, printed in textbooks, and whispered into the ears of kings and colonizers that black people were cursed, that Africans were destined to serve, that slavery, injustice, and oppression were not only acceptable but divinely ordained. And the so-called biblical proof, the curse of Ham. But we've already exposed the lie at the center of it. Ham was never cursed. Noah's words in Genesis 9:25 were directed at Canaan, one of Ham's sons, not Ham himself, not Cush, not Misraim, and certainly not Phut. Yet that didn't stop theologians and empire builders from twisting scripture into a weapon. In the 18th and 19th centuries, during the height of the transatlantic slave trade, preachers stood in ornate churches and declared that Africans were the descendants of Ham, and that the curse upon Canaan applied to them all. They painted the entire African continent as a cursed lineage based on a verse that didn't even mention Africa. And Phut, he was swept up into this lie. He who had no curse, he who had no rebellion, he who carried the shield in silence was now dragged into chains by men who never knew his name. That's what happens when power rewrites theology. Scripture designed to reveal justice and mercy was bent into a tool of domination, not by atheists, not by pagans, but by those who claim to follow Christ. When men bend the Bible to serve power, we must ask who gets erased. And the answer is always the same: the ones who were silent, the ones who didn't write history, the ones like Phut. He became a symbol not of curse, but of what happens when truth is ignored in favor of narrative. Phut's silence wasn't damning, it was sacred, but it made him vulnerable, Because in a world that only remembers those who shout the loudest, the quiet ones are the easiest to rewrite. That's why it's so important we get this right. Because this isn't just about ancient Libya. It's about every person, every nation, every community who's been told they were less than because someone twisted a verse. The Bible does not teach racial hierarchy. It does not assign worth based on skin or continent. It never once declares that any people were born to be dominated. In fact, it does the opposite. And Phut stands as a quiet but powerful testimony to that truth. He was not cursed. He was not erased by God, only by men. And today we reclaim his name, because when history silences someone, sometimes it's the job of the present to speak for them. But before we close, there's one final revelation left. A truth hidden not in curses or wars, but in what Phut's life still says to us today. And trust me, this final message might just be about you. Part 8. The Righteous Who Walked in Silence. In a world obsessed with legacy, spotlight, and noise, we tend to forget the quiet ones. The ones who never held thrones. The ones who weren't written about in headlines. The ones who didn't lead armies or shape kingdoms but stood in the shadows and still remained faithful. Phut was one of them. He never cursed. He never rebelled. He never claimed power or demanded recognition. He simply stood named by God, but not defined by the world. And that's where his power lies. Because sometimes the greatest stories in Scripture aren't the loudest. They're the ones whispered between the lines. Phut didn't build Babel. He didn't mock prophets. He didn't lead anyone into idolatry or war against Israel. He just existed. In dignity, in silence, in strength. And maybe that's the message we've missed all along. Maybe you are Phut. Maybe you've spent years feeling invisible, doing what's right without applause, serving without acknowledgement, living in the quiet spaces outside the spotlight, outside the platform, outside the praise. Maybe no one ever told your story. Maybe you felt like your name has been left out of history. But hear this, heaven has not forgotten you. God remembers what men ignore. God values what the world overlooks. And God does not measure greatness by visibility. Phut reminds us that you don't have to be seen to be sacred. You don't have to be famous to be favored. You don't need 1,000 followers to be faithful. And you don't need your name written in books, when it's already written in the book of life. Let that sink in. Phut was not cursed. Phut was not judged. Phut was not erased. He was preserved. And maybe you haven't been forgotten either. Maybe you've been hidden for a purpose. Because God often reserves his greatest vessels for the moments no one else is watching, for the battles no one else sees, for the generations yet to come. So don't mistake your silence for insignificance. Don't confuse your absence from the stage with absence from God's plan. The silence of the righteous is sometimes the loudest sermon of all. And now if you're older, if your name isn't known, if you've lived a long, quiet life of faith, then listen closely. Because the next message is for you. It's a message Phut would have understood better than anyone. A message for those who walked the desert roads, who stood guard at the borders, who carried the shield without asking for glory. The forgotten faithful. You are not forgotten. Stay with me, because what comes next is your legacy. In a world that celebrates fame, loud voices, and visible success, the story of Phut reminds us of a deeper truth. You don't need to be in the spotlight to be chosen by God. Phut never led a nation, never wrote a psalm, never performed a miracle. Yet he was named in Scripture not to be glorified, but to show that presence matters even in silence. His life speaks to those who've lived quietly, faithfully, and often unseen. To those who've carried burdens, raised families, served others without recognition. Especially for older generations, this message resonates. God remembers what history forgets. The prayers no one saw, the sacrifices no one applauded, the courage it took just to keep going, all of it matters to him. Phut's silence was not a void, it was a form of obedience. And sometimes that's the most powerful testimony of all. Your life is not behind you, it's within you. And like Phut, you may not have built empires, but you've built legacies, quiet ones, faithful ones, eternal ones. In God's eyes, that is more than enough. That is sacred. And it's never too late to realize you were never forgotten, you were being preserved.